Hi guys, hope that you're doing well and that you've been enjoying our series where we've been releasing a video every week as we're going through an 8-week plan looking at the story of the Bible. This week we are on week 5, I believe it is, and we are looking at what I call the hinge of the Bible, which is the theme of exile. And I call it the hinge because it's the hinge that brings us from the Old Testament and swings us into the New Testament. And I actually think that sometimes this part of the Bible is overlooked, and it might seem a bit small and insignificant, but actually it's so important for us to look at and understand. And actually loads of the books in the Bible talk about or are written in or either in response to or looking ahead to this time of exile. And so we remember last week how we saw that God had called the people of Israel to be a kingdom of priests, his representatives to the world. And he wanted them to live in a certain way in order to do that. But the people of Israel sadly continually refuse to live in God's way. And he keeps sending them, the prophets, to warn them and say, this is what God has called you to do. Remember this law, remember the covenant that he's given you. But continually they refuse and they choose, to live in a way that is less than what God has planned and purposed for his people. And so sadly, the result is exile. There's consequences because God has this way of being an image bearer for them, going back to week 2, but they continually choose the way of being less than human and less than the best that God has for them. So we have in 2 Chronicles a summary, 2 Chronicles 36, the very last pages of Chronicles, of what happens to the people of Israel. And it says that God gave Israel all into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles of the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the kings and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. So the place that was supposed to be the touch point of heaven on earth, God's presence housed in this beautiful building amongst these people that were supposed to live in a way that represented God to the world, was destroyed. And its people were carried off away because they had disobeyed God and had refused to live as an image bearer of him and his kingdom. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment with the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. Interestingly, it says that while the people of Israel were out of the land, one of the commandments that God had given to the people of Israel was that every 7 years they were to allow the land to have a rest, to not work the land. And that was to be its Sabbath. And we know that every 7 days they themselves were to rest. The Jewish people to this day still continue to observe Shabbat by not doing certain things on Saturdays. And so they were told by God clearly to allow the land to rest and to allow themselves to rest. And every 50 years, for example, was to be a year of Jubilee. Every seven years was the 49th year, which was to be another Sabbath. But then after that 7, there was to be a year of Jubilee when land was restored, given back to people, slaves were set free. It was this kind of celebratory year and a year to put things right again. And all of these things were symbols that were supposed to speak to the rest of the world and to the people of Israel about what living in God and his kingdom looks like. But the people did not live up to their end of the bargain. And we know that from the very beginning there was alarm bells because God calls the people to say, this is what I want. I want you to be a kingdom of priests for me, my treasured possession. And they say, yeah, that sounds good. But then when they see what that entails, they say, no, we want to stand at a distance and we will send Moses on our behalf, or we will allow David to be the king that rules over us, rather than taking responsibility and when bad kings come into power, overthrowing them and putting good rulers in place. The people don't do that. But somehow God still manages to work with his people despite the wrong choices and the bad choices that they make. He's gracious and he allows them to make those choices and continues to lead them forward in his plan and purpose and salvation. And what's even more amazing is that some of the best examples of Jewish people, Israeli people, that do act as God's image bearers to the world are the ones who are born in captivity or taken into captivity in Babylon. They are the ones that actually do what God has been trying to get Israel to do since its inception all those years ago. They are the ones that actually take the responsibility, like Moses did, like David did, like Abraham did way back when, of accepting the responsibility that God has given them. We see stories of Daniel, for example, who knows his purpose as an image bearer and prays towards Jerusalem to fix his eyes on that touch point of heaven on earth every single day. And when he's told to not do that, he says, actually, sorry, I'm going to continue to do it because I need to be an image bearer of God. I need that prayer life that is going to anchor me in who God is and his plan for my life. And so he's taken and he's put into the pit of the beasts, of the lions, in the nation that represents the way of the beast, and he's in exile in. He's taken in that nation of beasts, or not literal beasts, but the symbolism of the Bible, people that are not living for God and his kingdom, and he's put in the pit of the beasts. But because even in that context he will refuse to go that way, and he continues to choose the way of being an image bearer, he is raised up victorious over death because of that choice to follow God in his way. We see Esther, the young Jewish girl who rises to prominence as the queen of a whole land and uses her authority to stand against injustice, to stand up for righteousness, which she knows as a Jewish person is what God has called her to as an image bearer. And she stands in the gap as a priest who goes before the king on behalf of her people and saves her people. And all of these are foreshadows of a certain figure, which we're going to come on to next week, who I'm sure you're already thinking about from the way I've described both Daniel and Esther. Foreshadowing this true God-man, human and divine, who is going to come as one and represent what it means to be both a king and a priest in one person for us perfectly. But before we do that, Israel are, of course, in exile. So the exile does finally end, thankfully, and the people of Israel brought back into their land. But things aren't perfect, and they have this sense of surely there's something more than what we're experiencing at the moment. Surely there must be more to this life than being back in the land, but not having a temple that was the temple that Ezekiel speaks about. There's something that's missing. And so when they were back in the land, there was even then this sense of exile in the people and wanting to be brought back fully into their plan and purpose that God had for them as a nation that was to be a nation of priests. And this is the context that Jesus is born into, and he comes announcing his gospel of the kingdom that makes it possible for Israel and all of the world to join in with God and his kingdom purposes. So Jesus isn't starting something new. That's the important thing that I want us to kind of pick up from looking in the Bible in this way. He's not doing away with Israel either. He's saying that the kingdom that Jesus announced was always what God had in mind right from the beginning, of being an image bearer of God, of being a true human, what it means for us, you and I, to be human beings. Jesus was bringing us back in contact with that thing. So next week we will get onto that, but for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this video has been helpful for you. Please let us know in the comments below and make sure that you subscribe so that you never miss a video from us. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye.